Okay, welcome everyone. I'm Anne Russo and I'm a professor in Women's and Gender Studies here at DePaul, and I'm also the director of the Women's Center. It's great to see each and every one of you today for Dr. Marquis Bey's talk and conversation. Black trans feminism is literally for everyone. I love that title very much. So thank you, Dr. Bey, for joining us. I'm so very honored. I'm really just honored to have you, and I'm looking forward to our conversation, and I've just really loved reading your work. Our event this evening is one of a number of events being created by the Women's Center connected to an ongoing theme in the Women's Center, which is Another World is Possible. And indeed, other worlds are being built and expanded every day. I was reading Marquis Bey today, and that was one of the key ideas, is that we're already existing in other worlds. And so here's a link to our listing of upcoming events by the Women's Center and affiliated programs at DePaul and beyond that speak to worlds in the making. So I hope you can join in with us. I want to offer up some gratitudes now to all those who've made this event possible. So I want to thank all the students in the Women's Center, the student workers in the Women's Center for helping make the event. Keish Lozano for creating our beautiful flyer and publicity and also helping with this event, as well as Rena Shenoy, Anna Molk, Grace Sigelman, and Aviv Goldman for all their efforts to get the word out and support the center. So thank you. And I want to thank all of our co-organizers and co-collaborators. So I want to express my deep gratitude to Dr. Julie Moody Freeman and the Center for Black Diaspora, Dr. Allison McCracken and American Studies, Barry Borich and the LGBTQ Studies Program, Isis Walker and the LGBTQIA+ Resource Center, Dr. Ann Mitchell and Critical Ethnic Studies, Dr. Rose Spalding and Peace, Justice, and Conflict Studies, and Dr. Rocio Ferreira and the Women's and Gender Studies. We couldn't have done it without you. I always say that, you know, sort of conjuring up Dora the Explorer. We couldn't have done it without you, so thank you. I also want to note that in the program, Dr. Marquis Bey will talk. Then we're going to open it up for question and answer. Yeah, and then that will be it. So I'm going to also thank Lauren Roundtree, who will introduce Dr. Marquis Bey. Lauren Roundtree, whose pronouns are they, them, is currently a second-year graduate student in the Women's and Gender Studies program at DePaul. We're very happy to have them. They identify as a Black, queer, non-binary person, and they are especially interested in Black queer feminisms. Along these lines, their final MA project in the program is very connected to this evening's conversation. It explores the intersections of Blackness and queerness with the argument that an understanding of Blackness as inherently queer is necessary for Black liberation. So please help me welcome Lauren Roundtree. Yay.
Thank you for that introduction for me. And now I'm going to introduce our speaker. So Professor Marquis Bey is an assistant professor of African American Studies and English, an advisory board faculty member of critical theory, and a faculty affiliate and advisory board member of gender and sexuality studies at Northwestern University. Professor Bey is the author of multiple books, including Them Goon Rules, Fugitive Essays on Radical Black Feminism, Anarcho-Blackness, Notes Towards a Black Anarchism, and The Problem of the Negro as a Problem for Gender. Bey's field-defining academic monograph, Black Trans Feminism, is published with Duke University Press. Black Trans Feminism theorizes Black trans feminism from the vantages of abolition and gender radicality, which are precipitated by an understanding of Blackness, transness, and Black feminism, as interested not in selective reform or gender proliferation, but in wholesale dismantling of the world we have been given. Via an examination of theoretical discourses in Black studies, trans studies, and feminist theory, the essays, interviews, and poems of Alexis Pauline Gumbs, J. Dodd, Venus Selenite, and what it could mean to live with hope in the world, Black trans feministically, which is, this is taken from the Marquis Bey's website. So it's a new word for me. Bey delivers an unparalleled articulation of radical theorizing on politics. Bey is also the author of System Failure, which is spelled CISTEM, Essays on Blackness and Cisgender, a collection of auto theory essays that explores the relationship or unrelationship between Blackness and the category of cisgender. Bey's academic writing has also been published in Hapasha, TSQ, Transgender Studies Quarterly, and other publications. And their expertise on trans subjectivity, non-binariness, Black feminism, and abolition has been featured in interviews with LGBTQ Nation, Time Magazine, The Washington Post, CNN, USA Today, and We Be Imagining podcast. So, as Dr. Rousseau mentioned before, Black, trans, and queer feminisms are at the center of my academic and personal interests. It's very important to me. And like previously mentioned, I'm currently working on a thesis project that explores the way in which Blackness is and has always been queer and trans. And so with my project, I channel a lot of everything that you write and do in your work, which is really important to me. So I appreciate you a lot for that. And I also hope to communicate the joyousness of transness that's often overshadowed by the mainstream portrayal of transness as a death sentence. And as I've become more familiar with Professor Bey and their work, I've realized that this is the scholarship that I've been craving for a really long time. As I'm reading it, I'm like, you're putting into words things that I've always wanted to see written. And so they've so eloquently and profoundly detailed the art of transness with a love and appreciation for the necessity of Blackness in that art. And it inspires me in so many ways. And I'm very happy to be here learning from you and with you. It's my honor to introduce you. And I just wanted to end with a quote that I thought was really great. Like I just loved it when I read it. And it goes, "I am ever romantic about the ways we move with restraint, a captive capacity that dissolves the captivity, letting us become in ways that might, who knows, unshackle the fetters fashioned by the captors. If only we knew we could move." So I'd very much like to welcome Professor Bey. And if you want to put like a sticker for applause or anything in the chat, you can do that now. So thanks for talking with us. Yeah.
Thank you. My goodness, that was such a beautiful, beautiful introduction, Lauren. Thank you so much for that. I'm deeply, deeply humbled. I really, really am. Thank you so, so much for that. And thank you all for coming too. Thank you for the invitation to speak to you all. And thank you for just organizing the space for us as well to talk about these things that I find to be incredibly important to me and to others. So without further ado then, I will get right into the talk, which is again titled Black Trans Feminism is Literally for Everyone. So I want to begin with giving an account, and I want to end with giving an account. My talk today will concern my recent book, Black Trans Feminism, and I'm hoping it will prove useful to give you all a sense of the where and why for the book, as well as the book's afterlife. So often these books just sort of appear. Maybe you heard someone give a talk surrounding the topic of the book a number of years ago. Maybe there was an article or two about a specific part of the book, but not very often is there a behind the intellectual scenes, as it were, for all these publications. I think that might prove quite interesting here. So I'd like to share a bit of that with you all at the outset here before delving into the reading of a few excerpts of the book itself. So what I'll do to give a roadmap of the structure of my remarks is share a bit about the before to the book, what happened before the book happened, and what had to happen in order for the book's ideas to happen. Then I'll read some key excerpts from the introduction of Black Trans Feminism, hopefully giving a sense of the tone of the book's ideas for those who may not have read it yet. And then I'll finish with the book's immediate afterlife. That is, now that the book is a book, what questions linger for others? What waves is the book making? How is the book continuing to live in others' lives? In short, the beginning, the during, and the after. So part one, the before. Long have I been a shy kid, though not friendless. Indeed, I have long had more friends than I actually wanted to have. I've been wondering as of late if there was something to that, as I imagine that there was, and certainly now is, something that means there was a certain reworking of where friendship might lie and in what friendship was grounded. This is to say simply that my friends were a bit eclectic and unexpected, by which I simply mean there was a way I moved with people who often would not move with each other. White kids who introduced me to rock and roll music and video games that someone like my brother wouldn't even consider. Hardcore men from urban Philadelphia who smoked weed and almost certainly engaged in illegal activities. Punk rocker girls who dyed their hair weekly. Nerds who fit exactly the stereotype of glasses and suspender wearing nerds. There was something about all of them that resonated with me, and something about me that resonated with them. And I don't know what it was exactly, but I know it wasn't what was expected. And lately, I've been thinking about how it is possible that that something was a kind of ineffability or illegibility, a going off the radar, a certain disposition toward dissent and escape that inflects in a number of ways. All of these things for me now inflect a thread of some kind of break or breach from normativity, from the proper. And it seems to me I've been making community and indeed subjectivity with myself and others on these grounds rather than other grounds understood as more proper. Now it's 2015. I entered Margot Natalie Crawford's graduate seminar at Cornell University, 21st Century African American Literature, not knowing that that class, or specifically week 2 of that class, would absolutely change me. During that week, we read Fred Moten's article, Black Op. I had been chasing after a justification that would be legible to others, that would make others see and feel what I saw and felt regarding the topic, regarding the impact his brief claim had on me. As he writes, quote, "Everyone whom Blackness claims, which is to say everyone can claim Blackness," unquote. It was and still is indefensible, and yet I defend it, or not defend it, but proliferate it, live via it, emerge in its excess. 10 years later, as he published that essay in PMLA in 2008, 10 years later, he extends this meditation, putting more language that I use for justification of the indefensible. In his book, The Universal Machine, Moten writes, and I quote here a bit of a long block quote, and this quote is also quite characteristic of Moten's very esoteric and dense and poetic style that's at once beautiful, but also super, super frustrating, but I'm going to quote it anyway. Quote, "While, as Frantz Fanon asserts, there is an imposition onto the figure of the Black that would signify the confluence of racial identity and racial inferiority, there is also, in a way that is prior to the regulative force of that imposition and calls it into question, a resource working through the epidermalization of aphantasmatic inferiority as the anti-epidermalization of the radical alternative, to which the peoples who are called Black have a kind of underprivileged relation in and as the very history of that imposition. One might speak then of the blackening of the common, which would imply neither that any and every person who is called Black claims or defends the socio-poetic force of that fantasy, nor that persons who are not called Black are disqualified from making such claims and enacting such defense," unquote. So in other words, Blackness is not a unique property only available to people who are called Black. Rather, Blackness is a kind of resource that produces the overturning of the regime of normativity, making Blackness available to anyone willing to take on the task, which would mean that people who are not typically called Black would be able to do Blackness, and those who are called Black might in fact not take up that task. Why is it that I've come to not being able to not think and feel and theorize this? What is it that I'm trying to convince others and myself of? Perhaps I'm not sure, and yet I continue. This claim that inducts and inaugurates transness as well, insofar as the trans indexes not a specific bodily arrangement or reconfiguration, not a specific anatomy, not a specific gendered or sexed relationship to the medical juridical, though to be sure, not exclusive of these things, but rather a refusal of gender as an organizing apparatus for how one ought to or is able to emerge onto the scene of sociality. Trans might not be a specific gender, but instead an insurgent commitment to not showing up on gender's grid. That is open to anyone committed to doing its work, which is to say, as my wonderful grad student has said, and this is a bit controversial, you can be trans too. Responsible for this, or perhaps I should say to blame for all of this, are two people, though there are of course a host of others that I will absolutely mention. But these two that I'll mention here are most acute. These two people are, as I've already shared, Fred Moten, and the other is Emi Koyama. So Fred Moten is incredibly popular right now. But to me, his popularity is not because of a deep reading and engagement with him necessarily. Rather, it is because many people like the reputation it gives them when they say certain phrases by Moten. They say undercommons, they say study, they say in the break, but they don't say para-ontological. They don't say Blackness must be understood in its ontological different from Black people. But I want to say these things. I think I must say these things. If, as Moten says, feeling and thinking and living with so many others, Blackness is not reducible to Black people. If, as Moten says, everyone whom Blackness claims, which is to say everyone can claim Blackness, if, as Moten says, Blackness is the anoriginal displacement of ontology, all phrases that I've been forced, blessedly so, to live with, then I must refuse the conception of Blackness as an identity, even as a form of non-identity based on wound and deprivation, and to regard it instead as a modality, an open modality of a kind of fugitivity. It is because I've sat with Moten and others too that I think this and must enact this. I've sat with and have had to sit with, have understood sitting with as an ethical terrain, Hortense Spillers, who has said in a reading of Ralph Ellison that Blackness marks a symbolic program of philosophical disobedience that will make the former available to anyone. This is an exact quote, that will make the former available to anyone, or more poignantly, any posture that was willing to take on the formidable task of thinking as a willful act of imagination and invention. I have sat with Kai Marshall Green, Black and non-binary and the deepest lover of Black and trans people, who has said, quote, not all Black people relate to the category or are marked by the category in the same way. Your Blackness might not be legible in certain places. Black is a category that we all have the ability to move in and out of, unquote, and asks of everyone looking to be in coalition, quote, what do your politics look like? And what kind of work do you do, unquote. I've sat with Ashawn Crowley, who has said Black social life has been the constant emergence of abolition as the grounding of its existence, the refusal of violence and violation as a way of life. And I have sat with Zora Neale Hurston, who has said that all skin folk ain't kinfolk. The second person I noted was Emi Koyama, a queer and trans thinker and activist responsible for the very phrase transfeminism. She might be said to be responsible, be to blame for, at least in part, my commitment to my own non-binariness, which in turn is further still responsible for where I intellectually and politically and ethically land, because non-binariness and transness in their insurgency are not mere descriptors of gendered identity, but indeed gender identity's subversion. Via this transfeminism, Koyama bears a particular relationship to gender, one that is not just, for example, an emphasis on transgender women or insistence on the validity and importance of representing trans people positively in media. Koyama used to identify as this gender and that gender, I'm quoting her here, and even the neither gender. But nowadays, she's tired of it all. Genderqueer used to work just fine when it was a non-identity, but now that there are communities of genderqueer people who identify with the label genderqueer, it no longer quite applies. That was Koyama. There is something refreshing in Koyama's yearning for language that in fact fractures language, inasmuch as the language we have is predicated on logics of staying on the side of the gendered world we were told to, and doing what that side demands. The trans and non-binary is the rejection of gender as an organizing apparatus for one's subjectivity. It is the refusal to be required to show up in the world on gendered grounds in order to show up in the world at all. And then, if I may, there is the Black feminist. I am forever thankful for my understanding of Black feminism by Hortense Spillers and Jennifer Nash. Spillers writes, not even in an academic publication or lecture, but in an interview located on her alma mater's website, that is Brandeis University. Spillers writes, quote, but I need to make a distinction between Black women as a subject of feminism, and Black feminism as a critical disposition. I should like to think that Black feminism as a repertoire of concepts, practices, and alignments is progressive in outlook and dedicated to the view that sustainable life systems must be available to everyone, unquote. Black feminism names not an identity one possesses, nor something only for a specific demographic, but is instead a disposition, a radical engendering of an insurgency that ravages racializing and gendering imposition. Then Jennifer Nash, who writes, quote, letting go represents the political and theoretical worldview this Black feminist project advances, a vision of Black feminist theory that is not invested in making property of knowledge, unquote. Excuse me. A quote, one second, y'all. A Black feminism that is expansive, welcoming anyone with an investment in Black women's humanity, intellectual labor, and political visionary work, anyone with an investment in theorizing Black genders and sexualities in complex and nuanced ways, unquote. And that is from her book, Black Feminism Reimagined. With these two thinkers and a beautifully radical number of others, Black feminism became and continues to become a promiscuous assemblage of theoretical and socio-political postures that seek to vitiate the regimes of categorization and, in short, the colonial project of Western modernity. Part 2, the during. Ultimately, I might say that Black trans feminism facilitates the disillusion of the things we may have come to regard as quite dear, namely our given and even reclaimed identities. It has come to a point, it seems to me, where many of us have crafted as virtuous the mere fact of holding steadfast to the historically maligned identities we hold. Many of us have come to doubling down on racial identification or gender identification and expression on the grounds that such identities have historically and contemporarily been expunged from the province of positive valuation. But there, to me, is little to be gained in clutching the purported fact, which is not a fact, unmediated and transparent, that one is right or righteous or unceasingly wise because they do not hold in contempt their racialized Blackness or their cis womanhood, for instance, categories that have been and are marginalized. That is not what all this is about. These identities are at base hegemonic bestowals and will thus have diminished liberatory import in the final analysis. Indeed, we cannot get to the final analysis, which I offer as an abolitionist analysis, with these identities if such an abolitionist terrain is given definition by way of the instantiation of the impossibility of violence and captivity. And this is borrowing from Fred Moten and Stefano Harney's understanding and definition of abolition. So in other words, abolition means that we get rid of any and all forms of violence and limiting what anyone can be. And I maintain that racial and gender identity, because they are imposed on us and disallow other ways to be ourselves, to emerge into the world, that abolition means that race and gender are eradicated too. This is the controversial claim that I often make. Black trans feminism cannot abide such classificatory violences, so it urges us to abolish the categories we may love, even if they have not always been received well. If the aim of the radical project of Black trans feminism is abolition and gender radicality, which is the case that I make, it is imperative to grapple with what that actually means. We cannot do abolition halfway, holding on to some of the things we didn't think we would be called to task for giving up. If we want freedom, we need to free ourselves also of the things with which we capture ourselves. The project at hand is interested in a thoroughgoing conception of freeness, and it seems like Black trans feminism, to call on Saidiya Hartman, quote, makes everyone freer than they actually want to be, unquote. When the white woman or the Black trans person or the queer identified person comes at such a project with their indignation about me, us, Black trans feminism, trying to take away the very things that they work so hard to achieve, we are surely to meet them with a certain level of kindness as an ethical attentiveness to how such trauma has been felt and the joys of mitigating in whatever way those traumas. But, and I mean this, we are not to capitulate to a sort of abolished world because some people who may look like us or the people who have been forged in oppression are pleading to us. We still, even when grandma doesn't think she wants it, work to abolish the world. That is what Black trans feminism as an orientation toward radical freedom commits to, and that will not be easy, nor will it feel good in the ways we expect. And all of this will be terrifying. There is thus a different image of the world after the world I wish to posit, because I wish to take the scariness seriously. So abolition urges for the eradication of every and all violent holdovers. It is possible, though, that even on groundlessness, even in a wholly other world, we can be held insofar as we are embraced by that which does not know us, and in this unknowing, truly loves and caresses us. We might become anything at all, something wildly other than what we are. And in order to give into that, we need to be encountered by a world that really, actually, truly holds and loves us by never ever presuming to know what shape we will take, what we will want before we show up. We need to feel held, and we will be held when we are not known from the start. The world we inhabit after and amid abolition and gender radicality doesn't know a damn thing about us, and it smiles at such a fact, because when it finds out, it will know that we emerged from no coercion, no violence, and no impositions, and then we can begin another kind of living. There is thus a fundamental commitment to life and livability, and to modes of life that will not look like life precisely because of their dazzlingly abolitionist dwelling in the generative rubble after the oft-mentioned end of the world. As such, Black trans feminism is given over as a loving but committed moving away from the constantly repeated rhetorical move, violence against women, especially trans women, violence against trans women, especially trans women of color, or especially Black trans women. That move is understandable, and please keep making that gesture when it is appropriate as a way to highlight the populations onto which violation is disproportionately imposed, because we know trans antagonism is very much about the targeting of poor Black trans women and trans women of color. I offer a caution, however, in service of an attempted refutation of the assumption embedded in the emphasized subclauses, an assumption that the subclause is Black trans feminism, that one's Black trans feminism is encapsulated by pointing to the violated lives and deaths of Black trans women. This, to me, only troublingly allows Black trans femme subjectivity to emerge through violence. Black trans feminism, as articulated in this project, is a love letter, a box of chocolates, a warm hug, a place to sleep after a hot meal for those who live in excess of that purportedly unlivable nexus and those hailed by those analytic names, and further, for those whose subjectivities are such that the world cannot yet accommodate them. And part 3, the actor. What about? Yes, that is so often the question, the what about? What about Black bodies and anti-Blackness and history and the cop that would not hesitate to shoot you? What about actual trans people, actual Black women? Those are the questions, and I feel them so much. I feel the plea and the passion. But it is a troubling assumption and sentiment to me, at least its implications. It seems to me that Blackness, for instance, becomes and is primarily and often solely its openness to terror and violation. It is definitionally given over to and made real and existent by the ravages of white supremacy. but that is not my or many, many others' understanding of Blackness. There is, for me and many others, a capacity definitional of Blackness, one that then implies an inability to be closed and foreclosed in such a way as to give primacy to the defining limbs of whiteness's ontology. This recalibration raises the specter of a loss. Indeed, yes, we will lose the ability to covet and assume that this is only ours. We will lose the quips that imply a kind of Black folks, all Black folks, know it all, while white folks, to say nothing of other kinds of folks, do not. We will lose also some folks we thought were down for the struggle simply by virtue of their epidermis, because it turns out they, which might be more numerous than we anticipate, weren't actually putting in much work. We'll lose all of this and more. But I want to steadfastly submit that losing these things, which is not a loss, engenders something, makes something else possible. I know there is a profound feeling of loss in this conceptualization. I know it intimately, but I still hold to this. And I hold to this in the face of knowing very deeply the fear and feeling of loss. I had someone ask me to my face, if we give up even this, even in the face of all that Black and trans people have lost, having no claim to anything, what do we have left? And I answered to that person's face as sincerely and affectively and ethically as I could. We have everything else. To me, there is the matter of coalition at stake, a matter that is constitutive of Black feminist and trans feminist politics. I take a lesson here from the Black feminism of Bernice Johnson Reagan. She writes, and I'm quoting here, "It must become necessary for us all to feel that this is our world, and that we are here to stay, and that anything that is here is ours to take and to use in our image. And watch that hour, make it as big as you can. It ain't got nothing to do with that barred room, which she defined as a space where there are only folk that look like you. The hour must include everybody you have to include in order for you to survive, because I ain't gonna let you live unless you let me live. Now there's danger in that, but there's also the possibility that we can both live if you can stand it," unquote. And my God, that messed me up when I first read it. And it messed me up in part because she says something that I didn't know was sayable. And that opened up so much for me and for others as well. Because this led me to thinking about capacity and radicality and those who move through it and indeed attempt to emerge through it. It led me to think about the Black radical tradition and trans insurgency as not an occupation of the barred room, a room with people who we presume look like us. Because if there is one thing among many, many other things that trans studies has gifted me, it is a skepticism and interrogation of the tyranny of the corporeal, the embodied, as being imbued with transparent truth, to always be critical of the visual as indexical of the truthfulness of a subject. So these traditions are not barred rooms, but perhaps open terrains. And they, via their Blackness and their transness, which are modalities and postures and politics and subversive relations to power, are even more than radically inclusive. They are radically non-exclusive. So I must constantly ask myself and others, can you stand that? And you will get, of course, the quip about the cops, about white people not hesitating to call the cops, cops not hesitating to shoot you. And I respond as one scholar responds, and I quote her response, which is actually a question, quote, "When did those of us interested in defying white supremacy collectively decide that the white supremacist held by the cop, the nurse, the teacher, the president, had the ontological power to define us," unquote. I commit to the notion that we need not have settled and made unambiguous who the most marginalized demographic is, nor the exact parameters of those demographics. In the vein of gender, for example, we need not settle quote unquote woman or even the parameters of gender in order to advance a politics in service of those harmed by sexism and trans antagonism, and indeed harmed by gender itself. When laws and social policy represent women, Judith Butler writes, reflecting on the legacy of their now 30-year-old book, quote, They make tacit decisions about who counts as a woman, and very often make presuppositions about what a woman is. We have seen this in the domain of reproductive rights. So the question I was asking then is, do we need to have a settled idea of women or of any gender in order to advance feminist goals, unquote? And for me, the answer is no. We can and have and should be doing subjectivity and sociality in ways that engender a different terrain on which we can live that need not, and perhaps should not, be concerned with a particular demographic. Not because that demographic does not matter, but because it's less about the demographic and more about the mechanisms in place, the histories, variable as they are, the discourses, the systems, the institutions, the structures, the networks that create demographic delimitations to be placed in hierarchical and antagonistic relationship in the first place. It is about what happened that made logical the invention of a denigrated class of people or non-people as natural. That is the cause we must not forget. The ethical world, or perhaps I should say, the ethical relation to sociality, to the earth that we work toward is gotten to by way of abolishing these various taxonomies. That world eradicates them as such in its very course. We cannot wait to dissolve these divisions after the revolution precisely because the process of moving toward this radical, just world involves constitutively tearing asunder normative regimes, racial and gender categorizations among them. My project, my ethical and socio-political and radical commitments are attempts to proliferate analytic maneuvers that make the conditions for life and livability such that even those who have not been permitted to appear might finally be able to. If my project falls under the heading, as is the title of the book, of Black trans feminism, then it is not a narrow project. It is coalitionally oriented always. That is to say, it must be complemented by another project under a different heading, say that of decolonial radical socialism or indigenous eco-insurgencies or what have you. Black trans feminism, or whatever I or anyone else calls such radical work, neither supersedes nor rejects these other things. They are all in coalition, working angles and avenues in service of another way to be that does not stand for the ills that plague us. That other way has come under a certain banner here, because I am not talking about identificatory possessions and putting them in hierarchical relation, but rather politics and forces, modalities and relations. It is able to be maintained that such a project called Black trans feminism does not work over and against other radical projects in a supersessionist sense. Of interest is a generative promiscuity that is flexible and non-territorial, that is uninterested in territorial gestures, and allows for other projects of radicality to serve not as competitors, but accomplices in the struggle together. I believe all of this, all of what I've been saying. At the same time, I tell myself and others that I want to belong somewhere, as Mackenzie Wark says, in a trans gesture that reckons with how her transness necessitates in some way the obliteration of what has become the being onto which her transness is cast. Quote, but I don't want an identity, unquote. That's from Mackenzie Wark. I want to belong somewhere, but I don't want an identity. The very notion of identity is to me a bad philosophical project that has held sway over how we've understood what is possible for us. There is an obsession with how to pin down, how to get at the fundamental element, how to not have to think about being something else at the heart of this international Westphalian order, this political and philosophical project of sovereignty in the Western modernity sense. We can be without making recourse to the paltry scraps we've been given, like a bad flight offering only chicken or fish when we've been vegetarians for a while now. What would it be like to have food that sustains us, food we can eat, food that is not predicated on the slaughtering of others? There is an immeasurable array of wondrous things and wondrous ways I may have come into the world, which is not to say that my physiognomy is infinitely mutable, but that my physiognomy is always subject to being read, a reading that is vastly contingent on what is discursively and historically permissible, which claims the very meaning, the very contours of me, One's matter and form are not innocent, not transparent, but are always mediated through the ways modernity is infused with the anatomy of coloniality. To be given an identity, which is always the causal relation, for we are thrown into a terrain we are forced to struggle with, is to be disallowed from the jump, the other things in the array of possibilities. So to bring this to a close, it may not be about erecting something at all. It may be much more fruitful and interesting to think of how we can come to something like what we might have been through this pervasive abolition, through, as it were, a project not of putting things together, but of viewing with soft eyes, feeling with humbled breath the gloriousness of how things fall apart. And the shards lying there is a mosaic of pieces you can pick up and carry with you, fondling it in your hands, tucking it in your pocket, only to discard it later. Or you can stomp on the shards, grinding them into smaller pieces, awing at their disintegration. Or further still, you can step over the pile, walking into the sunset. Thank you all so, so much. I'm assuming there will be Q&A.
Oh my
right
goodness,
now.
thank you so much.
Of course.
I'm still kind of,
A little bit of an echo.
okay, can you hear me now? Okay, sorry about that. Zoom issues. Anyway, I just wanted to thank you so much, Marquis Bey, for such a, yeah, just like an amazing talk. You know, it's like opening up all these different ideas and paths, I think, and kind of having to rethink everything in so many ways. And yet there's all these legacies that you're also drawing on. So it's really, really beautiful. So I'm just going to open it up to the audience. So if you all want to ask some questions or offer some thoughts in the chat, then we can use those as a basis for more conversation.
And I'll say too briefly
Does
that
anybody want to jump in?
I know there's always this lull at the beginning of a Q&A, and that's okay. That's perfectly okay. If y'all need time to think, that's fine. I'm very okay sitting in silence. I do this with my students all the time, but take the time you need to think about the question that you want to formulate.
It's disabled? No, it's open. Oh, wait. It's open now.
We good now?
Yeah.
And don't be shy, y'all. Do not be shy. I've gotten many, many questions, and I'm sure I've gotten questions that are worse than some of the things you all are thinking. So please feel free to share, to comment, to ask, to inquire, anything like that. This was wonderful, challenging. Yeah, it's challenging for me too, actually, if I'm being honest. I'm still sitting with emotionally these things that I'm suggesting and offering to folks. So it's perhaps going to be a never ending sitting with these things. So challenging for sure. Oh, thank you, thank you, thank you.
Hi, Dr. Bey.
Hi.
So you're at Northwestern, correct?
Yes, correct, yes.
So what is it like talking and theorizing about abolition in a city like
Ooh.
Chicago, which has such a deep history of both police and prison brutality, but also of abolitionist organizing? And how has that had an effect on your own research and your own
Mhm.
coalition building here?
Oh, that's a wonderful, wonderful question. Thank you so much for that. So the there, I think two things I want to say. The first thing is that it's absolutely amazing that I can go into a classroom and talk about abolition and everyone's just like, yeah, absolutely. And like, you don't get pushback against that, which is a little bit strange, I would say. You're thinking about abolition in these incredibly pervasive ways, and students are like, yeah, let's do it. And that's a little bit shocking to me sometimes, but absolutely amazing. I love that. At the same time, however, there is sometimes this resistance, perhaps, to trying to push abolition in certain kinds of ways. So often people are thinking about abolition of the prison industrial complex, which is deeply needed, deeply, deeply needed. And yet don't want to push that in the realm of other kinds of categorizations, other kinds of disciplinary and violent apparatuses that I think also are doing the work of incarceration. And that makes it a little bit difficult to be so immersed in a discourse of abolition. Sometimes means that people are immersed in that discourse in such a way that they don't know how to move outside of that or think differently or understand that other people are thinking differently about this discourse. And that's a little bit of a challenge for me, but I understand that challenge as exciting, like incredibly exciting, because abolition as this shared discourse and shared language allows for us to have a kind of common ground that then permits us to engage with each other on grounds that are not me having to talk to this right-wing conservative, but like we're actually both thinking through abolition. So how can we use that as the basis and grounding for our communing in this sense? So it's a challenge sometimes, but overall it's quite exciting for me, I think, especially in Chicago. Well, there is a question in the chat. Is it cool if I just read the questions in the chat? So there's a question in the chat that reads, how do you respond to the ways that non-binary has been flattened into a category or even an aesthetic? How do we move away from this flattening? Beautiful question. So such a beautiful question. I think one of the things I do is to try to be very clear when I talk to other people. To be very clear. And this is kind of the work that I'm doing now. I'm moving into non-binary studies in my work specifically. And one of the things I'm trying to do is intervene in a general discourse. This is very prevalent in like social science type literature on non-binariness. And it's very much a non-binary representation, which we understand as this generally understood androgyny. And it's, to me, deeply extricated from a political and politicized way of encountering or refusing to encounter a gender. So I think I want to try to always be precise about the definition I'm giving to non-binariness. And one of the ways I do that is when I offer my own understanding of my own self. So I very rarely say that I am non-binary. Rather, how I understand myself is to have a non-binary relationship to gender, such that gender is deactivated as a regime that is one that organizes how I understand myself and how I want others to understand me. So to try to be clear about that, I want to say invites other people to sit with non-binariness in a different kind of way. It doesn't always work for sure, but that's the avenue that I take. And then we have another question in the chat. Very provocative talk. Thank you. Since we are so grounded in our identities politically, culturally, etc., how do we move to the radical position you are advocating? Another wonderful question that I actually just was talking about earlier today in a classroom. And the short version is that, so the example I gave earlier is when prison abolitionists, for example, are talking about abolish the prison industrial complex. And then so many people who think this is a gotcha moment, but it's really, really not, will say, well, what do we have in its place? And that's actually not the right question. The question or the response is that there are many, many things that are in, not even in its place, but that attempt to organize society in a different kind of way. Because the prison industrial complex presumes that discipline and punish and punitive and carceral measures are a kind of one-stop shop for solving all kinds of social ills and things like that. When in fact, we need myriad things, so many things, healthcare, we need psychological mentorship, we need various kinds of ways of promoting safety, we need all these different kinds of structures, or maybe not even structures, but relations in place. That's not simply one thing. So I think I want to respond to this question in a similar way, that so often these identities come in as kind of one-stop shop or blunt blanket kind of instruments that in fact are trying to think about a myriad of things that actually do not the best job at thinking through those things. So what I want to do is invite people to ask deeper questions, different kinds of questions. It's not that, for example, if we abolish gender, what do we do about pay disparities? That's not quite what it is. It's that gender stands in for actually a whole number of things that surely are about gender, but in fact are about various kinds of histories and systems and regimes and normativities and hegemony. So I want to try to ask those different kinds of questions. And when I try to invite people into those, asking those different kinds of questions, to show them that it's not that I or others are dispensing with the concerns that you have, which are very real and valid concerns, but that I want to actually try to get more at the root of the things that are concerns for us, which are oftentimes not these categorizations that have been imposed upon us, but rather different ways of relating, different ways of understanding ourselves, different opportunities, feelings of safety, reprieves from those kinds of horrific mechanisms that are betiding us. All those things are the things that, to me, are being responded to rather than these categorizations. And I want to really try to emphasize getting at the heart of those things instead of the categorization, which is very, very difficult, very, very difficult. So I try to do that. There's another question. I'm trying to scroll back up and see where, oh, there's a lot of stuff happening here.
If you'd like, I can, I'm keeping track of the questions here on the side so that you
would
can
be
kind of
wonderful.
focus.
That would be wonderful, yeah.
Just to give you kind of a visual break here. So the next question that came through was, again, thanking you for such a thought-provoking conversation. And then, could you elaborate on the ethical duty we have to care for those who might be traumatized by our attempts to dismantle the ontological quote unquote norms, gender, race, etc., that they/we have relied on for so long to make sense of the world? And how do we do this when so often folks react so violently to this dismantling?
Yeah, that's a great question that I don't have a great answer to. I really don't. But I take the question and I'll try my best briefly, because I want to try to get to as many questions as possible. So I think what I'll say is I always want to try, even though I fail at this sometimes, but I always want to try to hold and care for people in the things that they ask or the things that they express. Because for me, it's very rarely that someone is expressing these things or expressing a kind of resistance in a way that is inviting a kind of intellectual debate. These questions are coming from a place of not wanting to be left by the wayside. Like, in many ways, these questions are, well, what about me? How am I not going to be further marginalized and oppressed? And I want to really, really try to care for it and hold that. So then I sit with them. They might say something and I say more about that. I appreciate that, but I want you to say more about that. What I want to do is try to get at a sense of what is it that they're responding to? What kinds of things are motivating anxieties, fears, traumas, etc. Because those things matter a great deal. And I think those things rear when the things that I say sound very much like the things that some of their oppressors have said, or that seem to recapitulate some of the harm that they face. So my ethical imperative is to sit more genuinely with them, and to, rather than simply say, oh, this is what I think and what you think is wrong, rather than doing that, sit with them and hold them in the things that they express. I can imagine that sounds incredibly scary. Tell me more about what you're afraid of, and maybe we can think about different ways to perhaps achieve something that's not simply we might call it a Band-Aid, not simply something that will make you kind of feel good in the interim, but something that actually leads to a kind of liberation, a radical freedom. This freedom that Saidiya Hartman is talking about that we might not be ready for, that we might not want. That's the kind of thing I'm searching for, which is terrifying. And I want to try to hold people's hands while we get there. Because also I need my hand held sometimes as well. I need to also be cared for and held in those moments. So I think what I want to try to do is expand the coalition as much as possible. That way, then we can hold one another in the fears and anxieties that we have. So that's how I think I'd respond to that as briefly as possible. There's so much more to that, but I think that's my briefest response to that.
Beautiful. Thank you. Also, you offer so much, even in your briefest moments. Just wanted to
Thank you.
The next question that came through is, how do you think through or talk about race faking by white folks? And then they gave some examples, Rachel Dolezal, Jessica Krug. Or what do you think is the co-conspirator / ally response to anti-racism?
I don't know. I feel like some of y'all were listening to like me going about my day, because earlier today I was giving a kind of guest participant in a colleague's class who was teaching Rachel Dolezal, and I have not one but two essays on Rachel Dolezal, and I'm not going to get into all that. We don't have the time to get into that right now. There's a lot I have to say. This is a beautiful, wonderful, and important question, but I will table that for another time. Feel free to email me about that. I can go off about that. But I think to try to respond to the kind of the response of co-conspirators and allies with respect to anti-racism, I think the one thing I want to say is, how do I want to say this? What I'm interested in the discourse of co-conspiratorship, of allyship, of accompliceship, what I'm interested is not so much folks who understand themselves, for example, as white, who are then saying that I'm an ally to the cause or an accomplice or a co-conspirator, though we can quibble over the meaning of these words. I'm not so much interested in folks saying, I am this kind of subject and I'm going to help this cause. What I really want is for folks to get sullied in the struggle themselves, such that the pristineness of their racial, for example, privilege is actually muddied. So I'm really trying to get folks to think about, what does it mean to not understand oneself as an ally, which then means that one understands oneself as white, and then I am a part of I am away from the struggle, but rather I am a certain kind of subject doing a certain kind of work, and I'm going to be in the struggle with you, such that we are in coalition together. I'm thinking here in particular, I just finished listening to a podcast on the Weather Underground, phenomenal podcast called Mother Country Radicals. Highly recommend y'all listen to it. It's amazing. So thinking about the way that Weather Underground or other folk, or even the way that Fred Hampton, for example, is thinking about coalition. Like one of the things he says is, and I'm going to butcher the quote, but one of the things he said that he's less interested in policing the ability of white people to enter into the struggle. What he's interested in is the revolutionary mindset. And that to me is incredible to think about. I'm not so much interested, to be quite honest, in one's doubling down on their whiteness or even their blackness, but how can we proliferate this revolutionary mindset that will allow us to be in coalition for common aims, for common goals, which is then to say the subversion and opposition to power. That's what I'm interested in. So I want to really try to emphasize those things. And if folks are doing that work, then I care a little bit less about their racial identification, if I'm being honest. That's not to say those things are completely irrelevant. That's not but how can we in fact emphasize this thing that Fred Hampton called the revolutionary mindset, or this thing that Fred Moten calls a kind of primordial mutiny, fugitivity, that a whole bunch of other folks are talking about. I want to emphasize those things to then allow us to inhabit spaces on different grounds, those political and disposition grounds. I want to try to do that.
Awesome. That I think we might have time for just a couple more questions here. The next one that came through was, how would you show people that non-binary is more than a line? Does making it a 4D shape invite a broader conversation about abolition of systems that are also not linear, like the medical system that prejudices not cis people seeking medical assistance if one wants body modification to express themselves?
Oh, that's a great question. Another question that I also don't have a great answer to. So how would you show people that non-binary is more than a lie? I think one of the ways I try to show people is to, rather than focus on the non-binary, at least in this kind of scenario, rather than focus on the non-binary, because one of the ways that I think that people remain resistant to thinking a little bit more critically and expansively about gender and non-binariness and transness is the ways that these terms have become spectacularized in the popular imaginary. So the way that you say trans, you say non-binary, that then signals to the popular imaginary a certain kind of figure, a certain kind of discourse that people are trafficking in that they themselves do not want to be a part of. So rather than beginning there, what I want to try to think about is, so for example, this might not be the best example, but I try, even though I do not always succeed in it, I try to not meet people where they're at necessarily, but inhabit the discourses that they seem to be inhabiting. So if I understand that someone has also been subject to being read or understood in ways that they do not wish to be understood or read, I try to begin there. Tell me more about the things that happened inside of you, or the things that you felt when you say were misunderstood, or when you, like something as small as you went home after college and you wanted to be called Nick, but your dad kept calling you Nicholas. Like, but tell me more about what that felt like. And of course, these things are not the same, but that gives a little bit of an entry into the gravity, perhaps, of what happens when people are thrown outside of themselves, when people are understood and encountered in ways that they do not want, in ways that they do not anticipate or expect sometimes. So starting there then allows for me to try to have a different kind of conversation, one that's not spectacularized, because so often people, especially those who are not really privy to discourses in trans and non-binary studies, so often what happens is that they are not responding to the things that you are saying to them. They're responding to this mythology around the things, the topics that we're talking about. So how can we shift away from that and then meet them in a different kind of place that perhaps offers a different kind of conversation to happen? So I often try to start there, even though it doesn't always work, but I often try to start there.
Beautiful. From someone here in Anne's class, you write that a feminism that is immersed in a transitivity is tasked with refusing to be exhausted by exhaustion. How do you deal with exhaustion while doing this work? How does one refuse to be exhausted by the enormity of the talk you're proposing?
My goodness. How do I not get exhausted? I'm answering this question as someone who has been tired today. So there's a quote by Fred Moten, and I actually have this quote on the wall in my office in my home, actually. There's a quote by Fred Moten. I actually forget where it's from. It's from one of his poems, in which he says, "I'm exhausted, so my soul is rested." And what I think he means by that is, so often the work of fugitivity, the work of radicality and revolution is exhausting, absolutely exhausting. But that exhaustion is not ceaseless, as some people have accused me in my understanding of fugitivity, but it's in service of another part of us, another aspiration of what we wish to be, what we hope to aspire toward. It's an exhaustion in service of something, which for me at least allows me to be not non-exhausted, but a little less exhausted, I think. But also, I just try to, I don't know, I try to reflect on the things that bring me joy, that make me laugh, that make me smile, and I try to surround myself and immerse myself in those things as much as possible. Sometimes to the chagrin of the institution in which I find myself in. So be it. So be it. The institution, at least for me, university in my particular case, will not have a monopoly on my time or on my affective capacities. I will find joy in myriad ways outside of this institution, and also in ways that perhaps allow me to. Actually, no, I'm going to bracket that out for now. I'm about to say something that could have got me in trouble, so I'm not going to say that. But like one of the things that I do is really just try to immerse myself in the things that bring me joy and that make me smile. And I think that's incredibly important, especially when folks are doing radical work, whether that's activist work, whether that's academic or intellectual work, whether that's interpersonal work. There are so many different realms in which the work can be done, and to be able to find joy outside of and maybe sometimes within that is quite important. So like go to the gym if you need to, or listen to music if you play video games. All of these things are the things that I do, or whatever it is. So my partner, for example, crochets. Like there's so many different things, or like playing like Magic the Gathering or Dungeons and Dragons. All these kind of things, for me at least, are not trivial, but in fact allow one to persist. And that's the important thing. It's not about being able to be at this protest and do all the things, but it's about like the longevity of this, because this is a lifelong thing that so many people have been doing. How can you persist in doing all those things?
Incredible. And then just one kind of more big question before the last like little end here. In system failure, you talked about home and some of the struggles as a young trans person in the house. How do we coalition build in order to start turning houses into homes for younger trans or gender nonconforming or kids?
Okay, that is a great question. I think part of it is actually reconfiguring what we mean by home. I think so often, especially in popular culture, the popular imaginary, home is understood as equivalent to the place, the structure in which one was born, and the either parents or guardians or siblings or whomever that were also a part of that structure. And I think it's important to disaggregate those things, because so often people, especially queer and trans folks, do not feel at home in the house in which they grew up or were forced to grow up. So often those were places of violence and trauma and unsafety. So reconfiguring where home is located, or if home is located in a particular place at all, I think is a start, is definitely a start, because I want us to open ourselves up to the capacity to think about the ways that we find a certain kind of solace or joy or invigoration in relationships that oftentimes completely exceed the nuclear household, even the language of family, the way that we relate to one another. And we sometimes don't even have the language for that. And so often I think we revert back to the language of that is reared in the household. But can we in fact think about different language for this? And I'm drawing right now on a book I just read by a phenomenal friend and scholar, Sophie Lewis, called Abolish the Family. Phenomenal text. It's only like 80 pages, highly recommended, very easy to read. But I want to try to think about the other ways that we might relate to one another, that bring us a kind of joy and solace and care that are not affixed to a certain kind of structure, a certain kind of historical arrangement of people who are tied by some supposed notion of blood or anything like that. How can we, in fact, think outside of those things and forge relationality on other kinds of terms? I think that's a start. That's definitely a start to building that coalition, because then we won't feel the need, perhaps, at least implicitly, of having this particular relationship with someone who deemed my father or my mother or my brother or something like that. We'll begin to know that those meaningful relationships can happen elsewhere, and that those things are also valid relationships rather than one-off relationships, but ones that are deeply constitutive of who I am, what I need, what I want. So I think that's where I would start, I think.
Thank you. And then the last question here, ending a little bit on maybe a joyous note, offered up to us by Dr. Francesca Royster. What music feeds you and helps your theorizing these days?
Oh my goodness. Oh wow. Okay. Yeah. So what I'm listening to right now, there is a hip hop artist who I guess is underground-ish, called Aesop Rock, AESOP Rock. And so I was introduced to Aesop Rock when I was in undergrad, actually. And the reason why I was introduced to him was because I was scrolling some social media site and I saw that someone made this scatter plot of hip hop artists' vocabulary. So this person made a scatter plot of, I think the way that they did it was they took like the first 7 albums or songs or something of a person and of a person's lyrical corpus, and then they identified how many unique words they used in that. And then from that, they determined who had the largest vocabulary in hip hop at that time, at least. And I think it was done again somewhat recently. And the person who remains #1 in that scatter plot is Aesop Rock. And I am someone who's a word nerd and loves people with large vocabularies and lyricism. So I'm like, I need to listen to this person. And ever since then, I've been listening to Aesop Rock, because the way his mind works and the way he puts words together is absolutely phenomenal to me. Absolutely phenomenal to me. It makes me like think so many different kinds of things. It brings me so much joy. I find myself oftentimes writing to the rhythm of certain songs by Aesop Rock. That's how much he lives in my head. So I'm listening to Aesop Rock almost constantly. And yeah, that's my response. There's also this other artist named Kaan, and I love a lot of his songs. There's a song he has that's I think only available on YouTube called Concepts. There's also a Concepts 2, but the first one, Concepts, Kaan Seps. And that song gave me chills. Like it absolutely gave me chills. The lyricism of that song. It like he doesn't take a breath through the whole song. So all those things just really excite me, just really, really excite me. And I find myself either writing to the rhythm of some of those songs, or sometimes just finding myself being inspired by a line or a phrase and either incorporating that into my writing or being moved by that to think certain kinds of things. So those are the things that I'm listening to. I love that question. I really love that question. Thank you for that question.
Okay. Can you hear me now?
I can, yes.
Okay, hopefully everyone can. Well, thank you. Oh my goodness, thank you so
Thank
much.
you.
I just want to say you just have brought so much joy,
I'm
you know,
glad.
I mean, I could just really feel it at the end of this, like such joy of just possibilities and
Mhm.
new ways of thinking. And I think it'll be something that all of us will continue to think about, like everything that you've brought this evening and in your work. So I just really want to thank you so much again. And if everybody could write in the chat your thank yous and
Thank you.
gratitudes.
Thank
And
you all so much. This has been wonderful, absolutely wonderful. Y'all had some phenomenal questions. I really just appreciate y'all being here and sharing space and ideas and asking those questions. This is like the joy of what I do, to be able to have these kinds of conversations. So I'm just incredibly humbled and grateful for all of you for just being here. So thank you so much. And thank you so much for the invitation. And this has been amazing, absolutely amazing. I truly appreciate it.
well, thank you. Thank you so much. And this is recorded, so we'll be sharing it. You know, if you're interested in following up on that, we also have a lot of upcoming events that Keish is going to share. I want to thank Keish so much for all of your help with this event, including doing the questions when I couldn't figure out. I finally, at the end of this, figured out how to have the microphone on in the computer in the classroom without it being the way that it was. And also thank you so much, Lauren, for the introduction, and thanks to all the collaborators, and yeah, and we'll see you the next time. So thanks again.
See y'all.
Thank you so much, Marquis.
Thank you all. Thank you all. Y'all enjoy the rest of your evenings, okay?
We will. We'll figure out a way to bring you back.
Awesome. Looking forward to it. Very much looking forward to it.
Okay.
All right, y'all.
Bye.